size too, and in many ways we've saved, I think, the best for last. Don Worster's here, and for me personally and professionally, it was a moment to savor and remember. Moments like this don't come along that often, and I think we're all privileged to be here today to hear him, and it's going to be a little more intimate and close, and that's good. So I'm going to pass off to Jeff Cashin, the new Dean of Arts at Mount Royal University, to introduce Don Worster.
It's my distinct pleasure and honor, especially as an historian, to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Professor Don Worster. Presently, and especially in Canada, environmental history is considered to be still a relatively new but now burgeoning field. An area that's producing exciting, sophisticated, important, and to a large extent, interdisciplinary scholarship, including through a new SSHRC-supported network called Canadian History and Environment, or NICHE, that according to its publicity brings together historians, geographers, and other researchers who study nature and humans in Canada's past. The numerous articles and books that NICHE affiliated and other scholars who focus on the environment produce build on the pathbreaking work of pioneers in the field, especially pioneers like Don Worster, presently, well, you're retired now from the University of Kansas, but very recently, the Hall Distinguished Professor Chair in American History at Kansas. Professor Worster's incredibly impressive list of publications have greatly enriched and propelled forward the domain of environmental history, in the process of demonstrating its centrality to American story. He has published 10 books, most recently 2 prize-winning biographies, Passion for Nature, The Life of John Muir, and A River Running West, The Life of John Wesley Powell. His scholarship, which includes articles in some of the most highly respected journals, such as the Journal of American History, Agricultural History, Pacific Historical Review, has covered topics such as water resources in the West, the Dust Bowl during the Great Depression, and the development of the ecology movement since the 18th century, and translated, it's incredibly impressive, French, Italian, Spanish, Chinese, Swedish, Korean, Japanese. We're lucky if we get it translated into one other language. Professor Worster has served as president of the American Society for Environmental History, as advisory editor for the Cambridge University monograph series. The Cambridge is among those of us who work in the field, among the most prestigious presses in the world, studies in environmental history. His esteemed reputation has garnered invitations to speak in Asia. He's off to China, just after this conference, Africa, Europe, Central America, New Zealand, Australia, and of course, Canada. Recently, he was named the Strong Donnelly Distinguished Visiting Environmental Scholar at Yale University and a fellow for the Rachel Carson Center at Ludwig Maximilian University in Germany. Well, in 1972, the year that Paul Henderson made us famous, but also the year that Professor Worster received his PhD in American History and Literature from Yale University, the Club of Rome, a global think tank founded in 1968 that included men and women, mostly from politics, business, and science, dedicated, as they said, to tackling global problems and creating a better world, released a report that soon attained widespread coverage. A study that many, if not most of us, are familiar with. I read it at university, called Limits of Growth, and I think it's still on many university courses. Limits of Growth really didn't present an uplifting picture. Utilizing the famous 18th century work of Thomas Malthus, Limits of Growth pointed to a potentially cataclysmic future even collapsed by the mid-21st century because it said the availability of resources were finite, production increased in a linear fashion, but with population the tendency was towards the exponential. Although dismissed by many critics for its so-called doomsday scenario, 20 and 30-year updates to the work concluded that most of its assertions, or at least a portion of its assertions have held up. Indeed, despite our increasingly sophisticated technology, including in developing alternative forms of energy, efforts, including some controversial ones, to limit population growth, and our increasing global interconnectivity to address global problems, famine and misery of national poverty seem more and more common to what we hear. Today, a highly distinguished historian, author, scholar brings his perspective to this still influential and much debated work that remains core to scholarship on environmentalism, and more importantly, has much to say about the future of our planet. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Professor Dahl.
And wherever Rob went, thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
You've all got your coffee, you're going to stay awake. You got your sugar as well. So the room is a little smaller, fewer people. For some speakers, that's the last place you want to be, is last on the program. But it's fitting today because I'm going to be talking about smaller rooms and fewer people. That's our subject for today. We've been hearing a lot of great papers, presentations, memoirs, personal experiences about Canada, Alberta. I've learned a great deal from sessions I've heard so far. I'm going to step back today to something even broader than Scott Minnie's climate change. If there could be anything broader than that, both in cultural and in scientific terms. I want to start by taking us back to this man, this moment in history. Christopher Columbus, 1492. Fanciful picture. In the wake of Columbus's voyages, he made four of them, across the Atlantic Ocean, the map makers of the world, especially Europe, got busy. They began to construct a new revised picture of Earth. And the most popular and the most arresting image they came up with is this one, in my view. Two distinct spheres floating side by side. I call this the two Earths image. On the right is what one might call First Earth. That is the motherland of humanity, the so-called Old World, consisting of a nearly coterminous mass of Europe and Eurasia and Africa. And on the left is what we might call Second Earth. Not an orb that is as fully large as the first one, lying off to the west and consisting of North and South America and the adjoining oceans and islands. To me, this image suggests, and I don't think it's far-fetched, that a wandering planet from outer space has gently approached our home planet, edging closer and closer until the two planets touch, kiss, somewhere off the coast of Brazil. Happy collision, the beginning of a long and fertile romance. And so it's proved to be. From that moment of discovering a second Earth began the modern age of economic and social revolution, an age of infinite expectations and of infinite abundance. I know this second Earth is inhabited, was inhabited, but for Europeans that was a secondary matter. A founding father of economics, Adam Smith, put it this way: the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope, that's at the tip of Africa, are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. That's buried around page 600 in the Wealth of Nations. And we don't often quote this when we talk about Adam Smith. Well, that's a pretty impressive statement. What's he leaving out? Jesus. You know, the most important event in history, the discovery of America. I don't think Adam Smith knew quite what to do with this fact in creating the science of economics. But we'll leave that for a few minutes. The man who came up with this two-planet image was Rommel Mercator, who was the third son of the most famous geographer in Europe in the 16th century, Gerardus Mercator. In 1587, Mercator, the younger Mercator, came up with his image of the world. Let me go back. Use the chip. Came up with his image of the world, inscribed it in his father's workshop. Merchants bought copies to hang on the walls of their offices, anticipating, I suppose, a huge windfall of natural resources and wealth. Throughout the 17th century, it became the most popular projection of the Earth, the new map of the Earth. There were rival versions appearing in France, Germany, the Low Countries, Italy, etc. Rommel's notion of a second Earth, probably ought to go back to show you this once more, looms so large on the map that it almost overbalances the first Earth. South America, for example, look how Brazil bulges way out into the Atlantic Ocean, swelling to a size almost as large as Africa. In fact, it's only half as big. And North America, although it is accurately drawn around the Caribbean, which is an area they have plenty of information about, to some extent up the eastern seaboard, it extends far into the Arctic until it covers the entire North Pole. Adam Sowers was talking about the Arctic exploring expedition in the early 20th century, looking for that continent up there. Well, in Mercator's projection, there is no separate continent. Canada goes all the way. And what a Canada you get on this map. It dwarfs Eurasia. In fact, Eurasia is actually twice as large as North America. Okay, so Rommel got some of his facts wrong. There was really not quite that much on this second Earth. But his basic perception was indisputably true. And he was supported by these glorious images of abundance and plenty you see around the margin of the map. It's his father, by the way, down in the lower left-hand corner, Gerardus Mercator, and the other figures we don't need to go into. But you can just sense that this is a celebration, what? Of abundance, of infinite plenty. Abundance that had been long sought since antiquity and had been denied to Europeans by centuries of privation and want. But this is not quite the way we see the world today, is it? Today's images of Earth taken by cameras sent into outer space show a single, isolated, and highly vulnerable planet suspended in infinite void of blackness, forbidding blackness. Earth has become an infinitesimally small dot in that cosmos, a very lonely cosmos. Or I particularly like this next one. Can you find Earth? Scott can. That's it, the so-called blue dot image. Now we see our home planet as endangered, and we cannot find any third Earth sailing into view to rescue us. No more kisses. Today, 7 billion people inhabit that blue dot. 1 billion of them in the Western Hemisphere. More than 10 times the population that was here in 1492. According to a couple of scholars at the University of British Columbia, our numbers and appetites now exceed the planet's regenerative capacity. Humankind's ecological footprint, they say, and I'm not sure how scientists regard this estimate, but I give it to you nonetheless as an example of our changed thinking. Our ecological footprint is now half again as large as the Earth's carrying capacity over an indefinite period of time. The consuming habits of just two of those nations carved out of second Earth, the United States and Canada, would, if extended to every person on Earth, require 4 planets as large as ours to sustain. So we face some disturbing questions. Is the age of growth in population consumption that began with Columbus and Mercator coming to an end? Has a new age of limits begun? An age that may last for centuries? And if that is true, then what will be the consequences not only for those of us living in North America or in the Americas generally, but for those who do not enjoy the living standard of North America? When does this awareness of shrinking prospects begin? For some people it hasn't begun yet, of course, but you can trace it back up in people talking about, well, we're reaching the end of something, the end of the frontier, the end of the western frontier in the United States or Canada. People were talking about it around the turn of the 20th century. But I would trace this back actually to the 1940s and 50s, a sense of a globe itself, a planet that is now threatened and plundered. There are titles that come out in the late 1940s, Our Plundered Planet. But most dramatically to the year 1970. That was the year of the first Earth Day, when those images first began to appear largely in people's consciousness. And this morning I want to talk about a little book that put into powerful words and images that new understanding and perception. Jeffrey has just described that a little bit, but let me add a few more details to that description. Because I think this little book encapsulates our modern anxiety about this endangered, overcrowded Earth. The book had a huge initial impact, and then it seemed to lose influence for a number of years, but more recently it's been gathering fresh corroboration. It was published exactly 40 years ago, in the spring of 1972. Its main authors, I want to introduce to you. This is the book, my ratty copy that I picked up as a graduate student back when it first came out. Its main authors were Donella Meadows, who's on the right in this picture. In the left-hand picture, she's hiding behind the podium, so I got another picture so you can see her. She's actually the author of the book in terms of the words, the language, etc. Her husband, Dennis Meadows, standing at the podium. They seem to come out of nowhere to ignite a virulent debate. I'll introduce these other authors of the book as well at this point. Jorgen Randers, I'll come back to in a moment, and William Behrens. The debate is not over, of course. In fact, it seems to have become one of the central debates of our times. Donella Meadows, the main author, was born in 1941 in Elgin, Illinois. She earned a PhD in biophysics at Harvard, subsequently taught at Dartmouth College, founded the Sustainability Institute, and in 2007 died at a rather early age. Actually one of the great environmental figures of the last half century, perhaps not as well known as some others, but a very important leader of the environmental movement. Her husband, Dennis, her husband for many years, graduated from MIT Sloan School of Management. He's still very much alive. In fact, I'm going to be on a program with him in Munich in December talking about the book. He's now retired from the University of New Hampshire. They were assisted by Jorgen Randers, who was the son of the head of Norway's atomic energy program. And he received his doctorate at MIT 1 year after the book appeared. He's today a member of the Norwegian School of Management. And the youngest of these 4 youngsters, and they're all youngsters really, was William Behrens, on the left of this picture, an undergraduate at MIT when the book appeared. He now lives on a farm in Maine and refuses any communication with me or anybody else for as far as I can see. He wants to be free of all the controversies, I think, and the controversies weren't all. In any case, they seem an improbable group of people to write one of the defining texts of modern environmental thinking. All of them students or recent students. A bunch of graduate students and undergraduates, basically. Techie in style. And in 1972, they were all new to issues of environment and conservation. That's the most improbable, surprising thing about it. Dan's dissertation at Harvard was on bovine pancreatic ribonuclease, however, and Dennis wrote just as densely on hog market cycles. You can tell they're from Illinois. And then suddenly they leap from these barnyard themes into central long-term problems threatening the survival of civilization. Here are briefly the events leading to the commissioning and the writing of Mr. Grow. By the way, how many of you here have read it? Don't be ashamed if you haven't read a lot of it. Well, that's still only a small portion of this audience. It's kind of dropped out of sight and so on, but I certainly recommend that you go back and look at it. I mean, I'll say in a minute something to scale of this audience. In 1968, an Italian industrialist, Aurelio Pucci, who lived in Asia and South America and worked for a number of Italian corporations, but was very worried about consequences of economic development. And a Scot named Alexander King, who was a top science advisor for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe, got together. They were both dissatisfied with the approaches of economics and business and development to the problems of the world, and particularly to the idea that there are always technological solutions to everything. They were worried about a long list of problems, environmental degradation, conservation, and so on. And out of that concern, they established, as Jeffrey just told you, the Club of Rome. In July 1970, Pecce and King and other club members arrived on the MIT campus in the summer to meet with Professor Jay Forrester. I think I've got this picture on here. An electrical engineer, the father of so-called systems dynamics. Forrester had followed a rather circuitous route towards his ultimate work, which was building computer models of complex social systems. Models would allow us to think about how all the diverse variables work together instead of singly to produce often unexpected outcomes. And for this meeting with the Club of Rome, he inscribed on a bed sheet his computer model of the world. He called it his world system and hung it on the wall. So think of this great bed sheet with all these lines and variables and so forth going in different directions. Very complicated schematic. But it was to help these club members visualize the wild chaos that is our life today. Sometimes these are people who've been called technocrats trying to find a way to manage and govern the world. I think that's a misapprehension. They were trying to understand the complexity of the problems, and particularly the dimensions that had escaped short-term political thinking and often economic analysis and expertise. Well, in that summer of 1972, while the bed sheet is hanging on the wall, Dennis and Donella Meadows get back to Cambridge just in time for the seminar. They had missed the first Earth Day. Where were they while all this was happening? Well, they had, after getting their doctorates, pooled whatever money they had, bought a Land Rover in England, and drove across Europe into Asia. They wanted to see Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, a place you could drive across today, but in those days, they were going mountain climbing, they thought. All kinds of exotic places. But along the way, these two young people from Illinois, and MIT and Harvard, discovered global poverty, injustice, environmental destruction. In her unpublished memoir, Donella writes this. It's a long quotation, but I think it will capture something of the flavor that brought me into this project. I started the trip, a child of the Sputnik age, technological optimist, scientist in training. I thought science could solve all our problems. We didn't have to drive very far east into Asia to run into problems that my nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometer couldn't solve. For the first time in our lives, we were face to face with malnourished children and kids with open sores of smallpox. We saw beggars and houses collapsed by earthquakes and sewage running in open drains along streets. In the Indus Valley, we saw galloping soil erosion. In Sri Lanka, we saw the beginnings of a massive hydro dam that would flood out square miles of jungle. We saw dancing, singing, beautiful handicrafts, simple but ingenious native technologies, and ceremonies of deep spirituality. We began to wonder about the causes and consequences of poverty and development, population growth, erosion, deforestation. As the Land Rover bounced painfully across miles of dusty desert, we tried to make sense of what we were seeing. So they arrived in Massachusetts on the campus, look at the bed sheet, and their mentor, Jay Forrester, is standing there, invites them into the seminar. As it turns out, he had other projects in hand, so he turned to these two graduate students, postgraduate students now, to write a report for the Club of Rome using his computer model. And that's where they went from there. Now, Jeffrey mentioned the name Malthus, and I wanted to come to this because Jay Forrester himself is an interesting figure, still alive, I think. He'd grown up on the Nebraska Sandhills Ranch, but a hard life. He seems to have carried into his adulthood a sense of scarcity and limits and vulnerabilities. He called himself a Malthusian. But in fact, his ideas bore only a slight resemblance to a controversial 19th century economist. And I want to come back to this Malthusian, but basically the link here is exponential growth. Malthus talks about exponential growth. And the club in the Meadows in their report identify 5 kinds of exponential growth: accelerating industrialization, rapid population growth, widespread malnutrition, depletion of non-renewable resources, and finally, the generic deteriorating environment. And they went on to say, if the present growth trends in all of these continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. Later 30-year updates and so on, they run through them all the new data through the same models. There's a few changes there. But basically, it comes up to about the same thing. You see all these curves peaking somewhere in the middle or around the middle of this century, and then collapses and so on. I put these up not to go into great detail, just to give you a sense of the imagery that now we are faced with trying to understand these issues. It's not pretty stuff, it's kind of techy, but this is how we think today. And this is, I think, the ways in which we have learned how to think about these issues in ways we could never have done before. I'll come back to these guys in a minute. I guess I've left Malthus out of the picture, but basically, Malthus argued an exponential growth and so on. I think most of you understand what Malthus was about. Basically saying that somehow we had been instilled with an instinct to breed faster than our food supply could increase. He never explained exactly why that was the case, but basically, he's a reverend, he's an ordained minister, a believer in God and the church, and Jesus Christ and all of that. He believed it was God's hand, God's work. God had designed the world this way, given us this fertility urge that always outruns resources. Why? Well, to make us work harder to achieve civilization. I mean, that was the basic scheme behind it. Unless you practice abstinence or some kind of birth control, he said, we'll be trapped in this forever and ever. I'll never be able to escape it. That's God's will. That's not what Jay Forrester is talking about in any of these people. You know, in a broad sense, it is Malthusian, but it's not Malthusian in its ultimate explanations and so on. Well, in fact, I would say that the view of nature that the Club of Rome got in its report was radically different. The limits to growth says this: it is not known how much we can perturb the natural ecological balance of the earth. We don't know how far we can go in this. Malthus never worried about perturbing the ecological balance of the earth. That's what God intended us to do, was to perturb. Something new has entered the equation at this point. And I'll come back to it in a moment because I think my slides are let me turn to some of the reaction that comes from this. These accelerating patterns of growth. You can think of them as 5 locomotives going down tracks at faster and faster speeds. And at some point, they're going to reach a junction. They're going to collide. And when they do, all of these collapses will occur. Aurelio Pecci was so struck by the compelling data in these images that he urged the report be published. It wasn't originally intended to be published at all. Published quickly and distributed as widely as possible. So in March 1972, the Potomac Association of Washington, D.C. brought out the report in a slender book of about 200 pages. It's only about 80 or 90 pages of text. And it made a huge impact. It sold 12 million copies. It was translated into 37 languages. That's a lot more than I'll look at. 37 languages. It was the biggest selling environmental work of the modern era. It also stirred up a great deal of anger. Looking back on what followed, Donella wrote, we cannot understand the intensity of the reaction our book provoked. It seemed to us far out of proportion to our simple statement that the earth is finite and cannot support exponential growth for very long. Then she admitted, we were indeed trying to save the world. Part of me was still in the villages of India, in the deserts and the remnants of forest, and in the choking cities. I was trying to ensure that the future would be decent for people there and people everywhere. For the life of me, I couldn't see what was wrong with that. What was wrong with that was that the MIT group had challenged perhaps the central article of faith among secular elites of our time. On the left, as well as on the right, all over the world. That exponential economic growth is good, that it poses no serious risks or problems, and that it is absolutely necessary to the future of mankind. Most hostile reviewers of the book, the first reviews are actually very positive, but within about 6 months, other reviews began to come out all over the place. Many of them from the field of economics. They all acknowledge that the earth, yes, is indeed finite, and that someday all societies are going to have to deal with that fact. But the nearly universal response among critics was that those limits were a long way off, and that exponential growth could continue into the future as far as anyone could see. Let me give you a sampling quickly of some of the responses, particularly among academic economists. And I'm not here to satirize these people because I take them quite serious and I think they raise some very important issues. Carl Casey, the economic advisor to President John F. Kennedy, admitted these are serious and important problems, he said. They're pressing. But he said none of them are as urgent, and none of them have the degree of immediacy that the limits to growth would suggest. This is a mild objection. Others are far less generous. Yale economist Henry Wallace said, the limits to growth is a piece of irresponsible nonsense. And William Nordhaus, who's still in the faculty at Yale, I'll come back to him and we'll went on to say, this means an end to economic progress that the West has experienced since the Industrial Revolution. Those were not the only views coming out of economics departments. The Canadian-born professor of economics at Harvard, John Kenneth Galbraith, was far less hostile. Since the 1950s, he had been questioning the idea of the affluent society and asking whether our great appetite for materials, if, and I quote from him, it continues its geometric course, will not one day have to be restrained. This, he said, is the forbidden question. Over it hangs nearly a total silence. And then, one of the few economists who strongly agreed with the Meadows, the British-born and Oxford-educated Kenneth Boulding, quipped, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever and finite growth is either a madman or an economist. Why was there so much hostility among so many in economics, in business, engineering, politics? This is, I think, an important question to try to grapple with. And I'm writing a book on this subject, and I'll go into a lot more depth there. But I think the book basically challenged a moral mission. A moral mission. Somebody said that liberalism or neoliberalism has no ethics or morality. I disagree with that. I think it has a very strong moral sense, what it's after and so on. To promote human welfare all over the earth by showing nations the way to economic growth. I think that is a moral mission. From Christopher Freeman, a British economist, in a book critiquing the limits to growth, we get this. Since we believe that brute poverty is the main problem for most people in the world, and since in general we do not believe that the physical constraints are quite as pressing as the MIT group suggests, we do not accept their enthusiastic endorsement of zero growth as the ideal of the world. Never mind that the limits to growth was not an enthusiastic endorsement of zero population growth. They were simply trying to make that outcome as humane as possible, what they saw as an inevitable future. Well, the image that is evoked again, this is going back to all this, I'll pass through this. The image that is evoked again and again is, of course, the face of world poverty, the reality of world poverty. That people were obviously rightly concerned about. For only through growth, these economists are arguing, can the poor be fed and housed. The only alternative to growth is what? Is to take from the rich and redistribute to the poor. Taking from rich nations like the United States and Canada and giving to Haiti or India. And that alternative was viewed as impractical, unethical, and unwise. Impractical because it would never work. The rich would never give up their sumptuous dinners and their high-energy style of life. Unethical because it would require, for it to be carried out, an authoritarian government ruled by military cadres or some kind of dictatorial authority that would bring an end to freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy would not survive that outcome. It was also unwise to stop growth because it brought all kinds of other progress, moral progress, more and better human relations. So, economic growth was defended chiefly on the grounds, not that it was physically or environmentally possible, but as the Australian economist Heinz Arndt put it, it is desirable. That's what he puts it. What is desirable must be possible. All this grows out of what I think is the dominant moral worldview of many people in our modern economies. And I turned to an economist at MIT who has defined that moral vision. He calls it the classical liberal utilitarian viewpoint, which he says is utterly homocentric, basically centered completely on on people, their welfare, their expansion, and so on. And he goes on to say, our job is basically this: help people become better off than they had been, at least in terms of their own perceptions. Now that's an interesting little quality, in terms of their own perceptions. That is, he's saying the economists exist, the business community exists, to help people become better off as they define it. We don't have any role in defining what better off means. That's not our job, it's not our place. It's not our position to persuade people they've got enough. So if people perceive themselves as being poor, no matter how many automobiles they have in the garage, nobody has a right to tell them otherwise. Nobody has a right to tell them they have fewer children, to consume less, and so on. And therefore the earth becomes basically a utilitarian source of resources. So what do you do when the green light of an unspoiled continent has failed? When forests and soils and waters are depleted, rivers have become sewers, when nature no longer seems to offer the abundance it once offered? Well, the answer is quite simple. What is missing from the limits to growth models with all their charts and statistics is another kind of exponential growth. I gave you 5, but there's one that's missing. What is it? What's the 6th form of exponential growth that will solve all problems? You know what it is. Technology. Exponentially growing technology. If people, pollution, consumption are all growing exponentially, so can technology. It will keep up, manage to keep up with all these runaway trends. And so that, I think, is really finally the defining question as it came out in the 1970s. Is technology up to the task of meeting all our needs? Can technology create another Earth, a third Earth or a fourth Earth, as good as the first one? Usually, of course, the economists don't talk about creating a whole Earth. They try to talk about narrower subjects. Can we produce more food? Can we stop pollution? Can we overturn, this I think was probably the most central question of all in this debate, which is, I think, unfortunate because this is the key point, but can we overcome the depletion of specific resources through technology, like petroleum and copper? The MIT team had calculated that consumption would lead in less than 100 years to the exhaustion of such vital resources as aluminum, copper, tungsten, tin, mercury, natural gas, petroleum. Critics said not so. None of these resources is in short supply, and even if they become so, a substitute can always be found. Let me give you several quotations along this line. Robert Solow, Nobel Prize-winning economist at MIT, writes this: the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources. So exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe. Now, this sounds shocking at first, most of this, but what he means was that natural resources we needed in the past, forest, wood, that is, iron, or water, soil, will not be needed in the future. Or let's turn to the grand master of resource economics in the post-war era, Harold Barnett, author of the book Scarcity and Growth, published in 1963. Barnett put it this way: atoms and molecules and their energies, not fields and trees and fossils, are the building blocks of our time. That is, he's saying this: don't think about traditional resources, think about atoms and molecules. Engineers can take those atoms and molecules and create an infinite supply of natural resources. One of the most sweeping rebuttals of the limits to growth came from a couple of scientists at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. We are cornucopia, they proudly asserted, in the Science Journal. Even in this era of dwindling resources and in spite of dire predictions, they promised, celebrated that we were approaching the age of what they call infinite substitutability. It would arrive, they said, around the year 2300. So we got 200 years to get to that age, but infinite substitutability. By this point, they said, societies would learn how to go from ore to the common rocks or seawater. The Earth's crust, they pointed out, and many others echoed this, is loaded with all kinds of natural resources, but they're highly dispersed. Immense quantities of iron and aluminum are scattered through the soils of this earth. They are uneconomic to mine today, but tomorrow we will mine them. All we need is enough energy. Energy is the critical issue, not these other resources. And if we have enough energy, we can extract sunbeams from seawater. In the age of substitutability, they write, energy is the ultimate raw material. What they're talking about is nuclear fusion. That's the only source. You can't get there with renewable energies. There's no way. But they're talking about nuclear fusion. And so, as one of these authors puts it, with an inexhaustible source of energy, man could free himself from material want essentially forever. But what, of course, they're not talking about, any of these people, is the potential environmental impact of mining the common rocks and seawater. That's an irrelevant concern. There is indeed stored solar energy in seawater. There's oil under the sea. There's iron everywhere in the Earth's crust. And as we talked during this conference, there's gas, there's oil, deeper and deeper, etc. What they're really talking about is fracking, mountaintop removal, deep sea oil exploration, West Virginia, Alberta, the Gulf of Mexico. But getting it out might require a bit of ecological disturbance. And that's not part of the equation. So as long as we don't worry about the side effects of these extractive processes, there is no limit. And I think they're right on that. If we don't worry about the consequences, there is no limit to the commodities we can produce and consume. A new Earth is forever under our feet. 5 years after Limits to Growth book was published, Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell announced the MIT team had been proven a total fraud. The conversation was over. It had had a deleterious effect on debate. We wasted a lot of time, he said. The issue is now exhausted. He went on to denounce the book as a misuse of science, and he repeated the familiar refrain, economic growth is desirable, possible, and necessary. So by the late 1970s, some of you weren't around in that time, but late 1970s, the score, we were keeping score on the score, seemed decisively against the limits to growth. Growth team, 10. Limits team, 2. The election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, Margaret Thatcher, on and on. The simultaneous shift of public policy all over the world to our neoconservative ideology, which has lasted well into the 21st century, seemed to finalize the score and send the losers home in defeat. Growth, with as few impediments as possible, became the dominant cry in policy circles, and it's always today. If you talk to the German foreign minister, the head of IMF, Barack Obama, his opponent, Stephen Harper, they all basically, we're back to basic. Growth is what we all hunger for, need, and must have. But in fact, the game was not over. Our growth resumed its accustomed place at the head of world policy agenda. The idea of limits was quietly and subtly moving forward in public acceptance and in scientific support. I'm going to suggest for the next few minutes that the planet, in fact, does not seem to offer the wide open horizons it once did. Two critics of the modern environmental movement, Bjorn Lomborg of Denmark, some of you know his work, has lamented this fact. He says, the idea of limits to growth still retains a hold in the public imagination. Darn it. How the score eventually became tied and how the limits team rallied and began to move ahead on the scoreboard is a story that's never been told. When we have a longer perspective, I think we're likely to discover that it is the old popular growth idea that is dying. That we may be living through an age of revolution in consciousness. We'll have to look in the future and look back at this era to two levels. One, popular thinking, and two, thinking of natural science. On the popular level, all I have is anecdotal evidence, but let me suggest what some of it looks like. The experience of most people on this is one of crowds, depletion. On average, there are 20 people living on every square kilometer in the Western Hemisphere now. In the United States, over 30 per square kilometer. These densities are below world average. But growing populations are no longer greeted with much enthusiasm in the United States, Mexico, Costa Rica, probably even here in Canada, or maybe Quebec, let alone in China, which since the 1970s had a one-child policy, or Africa. Why? Because the consequences of these numbers have come home to people in the form of commuter gridlock, polluted waterways, agricultural fields drenched with chemicals to produce more and more food. I mean, this is only the consequence of population growth. I'm not narrowing it to that alone, but this is, to a great extent, a consequence of population growth, increasing intensification of agricultural industrialization and chemicalization. Another manifestation I would suggest comes from the intense daily battles over land and water that are going on in every country and certainly all over the United States and Canada. Whenever someone proposes a new airport or housing development or a pipeline through someone's property, somebody's going to raise a protest. Where most people live, growth has become a contentious issue. And as we've heard, it's not only environmental impact statements that we demand now, legal advice, etc., but even copyright law has been brought into bear on this. It's going to take decades to assess how far the public has advanced toward acknowledging natural limits. Rushing into that vacuum, the pessimists claim nothing is happening. The public's not paying any attention. Nothing will ever happen. If it does, it will come too late. In their 30-year update to the Limits to Growth, the Meadows team fell into that pessimistic mood. They wrote in the introduction, history, I always like it when people who don't read much history start, history teaches us that society has limited capacity for responding to those limits with far-sighted, wise, and altruistic measures. Historians can't really disagree with that. You know, we have a limited capacity. We know we're dealing with issues. That's not a question. But in the past, that human capacity for cultural change has often been large enough to bring about some pretty profound revolutions. That may be so today. And if it is, it will owe a lot not to historians, not to sociologists, not even to artists, although all of us are taking a role in this. It will owe a lot to new ideas and data coming from the natural sciences, which is perhaps the most revolutionary force in the world today. Building on the efforts of Jay Forrester and the Limits team, scientists have revealed more and more about the intricately balanced and highly vulnerable systems on which our lives depend. Pioneers of those systems are people that you know. Let me just mention what is going on, though, I think, in our discourse on these matters. It's no longer adequate to talk about natural resources in the old way, discrete commodities, tungsten, mercury, etc. And so that's the old conversation. And it still has some relevance, but what I think we need to think about is go beyond that concept and to talk about what some are calling the new scarcity, including some economists. Basically, the question of what happens to these systems when they reach a certain tipping point. And the people who've led us to this are numerous. They're in this room in some cases. But I'll just think about Paul Crutzen, the Dutch biogeochemist, winner of the Nobel Prize, and James Lovelock, the Gaia hypothesis. One could mention many, many more. Even economists are now beginning to talk in these ways. William Nordhaus at Yale, who denounced the limits to growth book, is now working very hard to figure out how much is this climate change going to cost us, and how are we going to be able to minimize the effects of it. And more recently, a group of economists met in Washington, D.C. to talk about how we deal with these issues, not just scarcity of old natural resources. And here's how they define the problem facing us today: the limitations on the environment's capacity to absorb and neutralize unprecedented waste streams of humanity. The threat of abrupt and possibly catastrophic climate change is the most dramatic, the most well-publicized change facing us today. But it is only one of many changes that we are learning about. According to a research team led by Johan Rockström of the Swedish Resilience Center in Stockholm, there are at least 8 other critical thresholds that we need to be aware of and avoid crossing. This is why I say to Scott, it's not only climate change, but there are 8 others. Thresholds of biodiversity. What is the point when we lose species that destabilizes all kinds of ecosystems? Not only carbon cycles, but nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, levels of stratospheric ozone, ocean acidification, fresh water use across this planet. When do we reach the point where fresh water is simply not enough to go around? Atmospheric aerosols, and finally chemical pollutants. These are not, again, specific commodities. We are talking about the ecological stability of the planet. And talking grandly about substitutes misses the point. There's no substitute for these. This is not a new idea, actually, for economics to deal with. If you go back to all of the founding fathers of economics, Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill, all of them said at some point in the future, we will reach the full complement of riches of our country. We will reach a point where the accumulation of wealth cannot go forward. This is John Stuart Mill writing in 1848. The increase of wealth is not boundless. At the end of what economists call the progressive state, that's the state we've been in, lies the stationary state. All progress in wealth is but a postponement of this. Now, in the Club of Rome's report, Limits to Growth, 1972, the club itself appended at the end a statement that I think is worth, I'm coming to my conclusion. The concept of a society in a steady state of economic and ecological equilibrium may appear easy to grasp, though the reality is so distant from our experiences to require a Copernican revolution of the mind. A Copernican revolution of the mind. They're making an historic analogy in this case, and this is where the historian comes trotting back in enthusiastically. It's one worth thinking about. This comparison between our changing view of the earth with the profound intellectual changes that followed the cosmological theories of Nicholas Copernicus That comparison appears more than once in recent writing. For example, in a 1999 paper published in the British journal Nature, H.J. Schnellenhuber of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany argues, and it's kind of clunky language, but he says, optical magnification instruments once brought about the Copernican revolution, which is the scientific revolution. That's where it begins. He's talking about telescopes. Okay. The telescope brought about the scientific and intellectual revolution, which finally put the Earth in its correct astrophysical context. And then he goes on to say, so sophisticated information compressing techniques, including simulation modeling, basically computers, are ushering in a second Copernican revolution. We are now learning to see for the first time, he says, the planet as one single, complex, dissipating, dynamic entity, far from thermodynamic equilibrium, the Earth system. Just 50 years after Columbus's voyage to second Earth, Polish astronomer Copernicus published his last and greatest work on the revolutions of the heavenly sphere. I've never read any historians who put these two people together, Columbus and Copernicus, but I think there was a profound connection. Both of them changed history. The changes were related. Before Copernicus, the Earth had been the fixed center of the universe, just as Europe was the fixed center of human history. 100 years later, astronomers had finally accepted that the Earth is only one of several planets in motion around the Sun, that the universe is far more grand and even infinite. This was the word they began to use. Infinite in dimensions than anyone before had realized. I don't think Mercator could have possibly thought about the Earth in this two-sphere way without thinking of Columbus's eyesight, like Evans' cosmology. Demoting the Earth to the center of the universe did not mean, of course, scaling down man's sense of the possibility. On the contrary, Copernicus, like Columbus, destroyed the old traditional sense of limits that had long constrained human imagination. These twin revolutions in cosmology and geography would bring fierce controversy in religion, philosophy, economics, race relations, politics, that would not end for centuries to come. The Catholic Church didn't make peace with Copernicus until the 19th century. We're still struggling with their implications today. Can we say with the Club of Rome and Schnellenhuber that another Copernican or post-Copernican revolution may be underway? A half century after Sputnik, 40 years after the publication of The Limits to Growth, the idea of a comprehensive Earth system science does seem to be emerging. A science to which ecologists, geologists, climatologists, and others are contributing. Whether this emergence adds up to a revolutionary change in our understanding, we will not know with certainty for a long time to come. But such an intellectual revolution is possible. And perhaps at some point it's even inevitable. If such a shift in consciousness occurs, then the book, The Limits to Growth, will rank historically as an important harbinger of change. Along with many other books and arguments, it will be seen to mark the beginning of an age that contrasts dramatically with the past 500 years. Instead of a period of unceasing economic growth and global expansion, which was the age Christopher Columbus and his contemporaries led us into, we may be facing a future time of limited growth or even no growth. We may be facing a shrinking, not an expanding Earth. Consequently, An era of expansion may be coming to a close, and a new era of equilibrium opening. Frankly, I don't know what we're going to do with economic growth. It seems to me the challenge to the economic community is to tell us how we can avoid those tipping points and still have growth. I'm an agnostic on this matter, but it seems to me that's the challenge for them to try to come up with. Accept these vulnerabilities and tell us if growth is important, how we're going to achieve it. Otherwise, we're going to have to make some really painful decisions. But if this is so, we are moving from an age of expansion to one of equilibrium, and I tend to believe it is so, then our future will open to us a new challenge. How to live on a more sustainable life on this one small earth, rotating so alone, so isolated in space. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Clearly, absolutely marvelous and thought-provoking speech. Now, I've checked the time. Because we started late, we ended a little bit over, and I'm going to defer to Rob. Would you like 5 minutes of questions?
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we keep it to 5 minutes, then you'll have time for lunch. So if you would like to ask questions from the floor, please.
And I hope in the plenary this afternoon, maybe some time will be allowed if you have questions. And I know you have questions for other people as well. But is there a question?
Yes.
Or comment?
There we go. First of all, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure it'll be resonating with a lot of us for some time to come. I'd like to get your thoughts on an economic position that I've come across, and I'm kind of agnostic on it myself, and that is that the dominant part of economic growth, at least in Western societies, has shifted from material consumption to consumption of services. And that is an area which can grow potentially infinitely in the sense that there's always more that we can do for one another, either voluntarily or for pay, and that we might be able to see sustained economic growth in that sphere even while we have a steady state or shrinking material consumption.
Well, that is a great question, and I haven't given a lot of thought, but I have thought about it some. It sounds plausible on the surface, you know. People profess we don't require many material resources, do we? We can look around the room. The physical resources that make it possible, our teaching, our campuses, our academic life, and so on. I don't see any diminution of consumption of material resource use as we moved increasingly to a service economy. It seems to me that that service economy continues to use material resources at a galloping rate. So somehow, when people talk about the etherealization of consumption, smaller and smaller little transistors, et cetera, but even again, this doesn't seem to, even as we diminish all those ways, we still seem to consume more in the whole, in the total. So it remains to be seen whether that's going to be an outcome or not.
Thanks again for such a wonderful talk. It gives us all quite a lot to think about. It seems to me that the hardest question that you've raised is how to make a transition from exponential growth to a flat line. You've challenged us to think about what life might look like when the line is flat. But it's that inflection that's the tough part. And in fact, in the graphs, in the limits to growth, the transition transition involves a very steep downhill run from the peaks of those curves to the flat parts of those curves. In fact, as you said, we have 7 billion people on the planet, only a billion or so in the Western Hemisphere. I would say maybe a different way to parse that. A billion of us who live the way we live, and 6 billion of us who don't. To get to the flat line, does 90% of humanity have to die? I mean, this is a disaster beyond, it's 100 times the number of fatalities of World War II. It's a disaster that puts the Black Plague into insignificance. Is that really what we have to go through to get to that flat line?
I don't believe it's what we have to get through, but to avoid that, we have to work on all those kinds of exponential growth. Now, population is the one you brought up here. You and I talked about this some during the conference. There are prognostications that by the middle of this century, we may reach a plateau, population plateau. I read recently something like 40% of the world's people live in countries that are either at zero population growth or negative or will reach it soon. But that includes China. China's population is still growing, but if they can maintain the one-child policy and it's under attack, that all seems to happen. So we've got 40 years before if that works out. I don't put much faith in those projections because it's all based on extrapolation from the past, and we don't know what people. The world may be converted to Romneyism, and we'll have 5 kids each again. I mean, we can't really altogether determine what people are going to do. But there is optimistic news on that front. But if we can get to the next 40 or 50 years, populations, they say, will plateau. My hunch is they will not plateau, they'll go down. I don't know any species in history that just goes up and reaches a plateau. They tend to go up and then they go down at some point. So we may see 100 years, 200 years from now, negative population growth around here. That's good news in many ways in dealing with all these problems. So, we can pick up pieces of all of these and say, what are we going to do about exponential growth in industrialization and so forth. But it's going to take a lot of change in public policies. The only agencies that can deal with these issues, I don't think the market is going to solve these problems, just pricing indicators, price signals. It's going to take policy decisions. And I don't think nations are going to be able to do this individually. Each nation operating individually to reach this outcome. It's going to have to require cooperative agreements among nations. That is, people in North America are going to have to be willing to see, instead of worrying about how fast China is growing and how we're losing out, say, that's good. We don't have to grow that fast. So these are, it took, how much time did it take us to go through a cultural change of attitudes after Columbus? It took a long time. It's from 1492 to 1776 before we get to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. So it may take us a century or two. And in that century or two, we may see a lot of hardship. We may see serious and terrible outcomes. I hope not, but in some sense, these people are pointing out we either got to have the good way or the bad way. We're going to get it one way or the other. And I can't say any more than that. One more question, and I think we need to go on. Yes.
What is the proposed title and what speech is saying of this law?
The title is Facing Limits. Now, I don't know what the subtitle is, but it's going to be about scarcity and abundance, particularly from a U.S. point of view, but I think it has broader implications. I haven't written it. I've got about a third of it written. I hope that it'll be out sometime. It won't be out next year, maybe the year after that. It'll be a short book. It's under contract with Oxford University Press. A short book on the biggest topic I know. I've written lots of big, long books on little people, one little person here and one little person there. So I'm writing a big book a little book on a big topic, but it's going to take a while for me to get through. But you've heard the gist of it. The rest will all be just a tale. Okay, thank you all again very much.
Hi everyone, just a quick word before you go. It is the lunch hour. The round table is going to go on at 1:10, and I just want to let you know what's involved there. It's going to be very interesting, relaxed, different kind of structure than we've had so far. Our keynotes remaining, Alana Mitchell, Donald Worcester, Scott Denning, Louise Haff, and artist Peter Bautista now. In an hour, they'll all be gathered up on that podium back there, and this wall will be down in the center room. And we'll be speaking very generally about the environment and matters of inspiration and our perspectives, and lots of time for audience Q&A. I'll be running around with microphones, you can just sit and take your easy on the stand and all. And we hope to see you there. It's a wonderful way to end the conference. I was very interested to hear you mention environmental technologies, because that is the 2014 Under Western Skies theme, looking at environmental technologies. We're excited about that, so if you could join us for today's roundtable to send off, to conclude the conference, that would be great. But there are matters of, you have to eat. So I just thought I'd let you know that I'm going to do this right now, so if anyone wants to come with us. I'm going to sweep across to the quad, which just leads into the center of Mount Royal, where the revolving doors are, and walk down the long hallway up the stairs at the end, and there's a student house there with a food court. Or if time is short, you're in the zone, you're just going to hover until the round table. It will start probably about 1:10. There's still fruit and Danishes and coffee and the like over there. So cheers all. Thank you for coming to this, and we'll see you shortly.